So cardiac looping is nothing but it's a combination of lengthening and bending of cardiac tubes. So as I mentioned earlier, there were initially two simple endothelial line tubes. So here suspended by the dorsal mesocardium, they start receiving blood and they are pumping. So they actually receive the blood from the caudal end, or in other words, if you can see in a cross section, the tubes are suspended like this. Okay, the tubes are suspended like this, and they are receiving the blood from the caudal end, they are receiving and they are pumping through the cranial end. And these tubes, with development, they start combining with each other. So for orientation purpose, we will take this tube like this, and it will be easier for us to understand. So these tubes will start, combining with each other to form a single tube. To form a single tube. But the single tube is uncombined at its caudal end. So this is the cranial end and this is the caudal end of the tube. But once they combine, they are uncombined at their caudal end. So you get what is called like somewhat like this. Okay, so they are uncombined at the caudal end. Other ends they are combined with each other. Okay, so once again they are pumping blood from the receiving from caudal end and they are pumping towards the cranial end. Okay. Not only this, the lengthening process also happening side by side. So the lengthening process is happening by means of secondary heart field cells, which are adding cells to this enlarging heart tube. So they start adding cells and cells and cells, and this starts forming a longer tube. So the lengthening process is because of the cells added by the secondary heart field to the developing heart tube. So it is enormously, it lengthens, or in other words, it elongates. Not only that happens, there is also asymmetrical development of the heart tube. In other words, the heart tube is not the same, has same diameter from the top to the bottom end, but it has some bulging here and there. Therefore, there are some asymmetrical bulging are present in the heart tube like this. So it is connected everywhere except at its caudal end. Okay. So this asymmetrical bulging are given certain names. So this is where the heart tube is receiving its blood is called as side by side blood islands are also formed. Okay, so they are actually ejected into the heart tube. So this blood, the receiving end of this thing is called as the horns. We have the right and the left horn, which is now receiving the blood. The chamber is called as sinus venosus, which then pumps into the primitive atria, which further pumps into the primitive ventricle, and which further pumps into a structure called as bulbous cordus. Now, the bulbous cordus is further divided into three parts: the proximal part or proximal one third, the middle one third, and the distal one third. Right? Now, the proximal one third has no special name as such, whereas the middle one third, this part, the middle one third, it's otherwise called as conus cordus. And the distal one third of bulbous cordus is called as truncus arteriosus. So this is going to give rise to various structures in future. For now, we will simply understand this one thing, that the two endothelial lined heart tubes pumping blood caudally to cranially by means of secondary heart field, which is adding more and more cells to this endothelial tube. It starts lengthened and elongates, and both the tubes combine with each other to form a single heart tube, except at its caudal end where they are unattached. And later on, they also asymmetrically elongate and develop. Because of this asymmetrical development, we have bulging at various ends of the tube. Therefore, the single heart tube gets termed into various structures within itself by means of right and the left arms, which receives the blood, pumps into a chamber called as sinus venosus, which further pumps into primitive atria, later into primitive ventricle, and most cranially we have a structure called as bulbous cordus, which is further divided into proximal one third, which has no special name, middle one third, otherwise called as conus cordus, and distal one third, which is otherwise called as truncus arteriosus. At the bulbous cordus and the primitive ventricle, we have a sulcus called as bulboventricular sulcus. So this is one more point to be mentioned. Now, this tube is it's a kind of oriented in a straight line. So it's a kind of oriented towards a straight line. But somewhere around day 23 of intrauterine life. So everything is happening during the period of starting from the middle of the third week going into the fourth week. So it's happening somewhere around day 23 of intrauterine life. This heart tube with asymmetrical bulging, which is oriented in a straight path, is now gets bended. So how it is bending? So the caudal end, which is this part, this caudal end, this caudal end moves cranially as well as dorsally. So dorsal is otherwise the posterior part. Okay, so it's moving cranially and dorsally. Whereas this part, which is the cranial end of the tube, is now moving caudally and getting placed ventrally. So For instance, this is the tube, and this tube is now bending like this. It's now bending like this. It's getting bent somewhere like this, and more bending is happening. More bending is happening like this, and somewhere it has come to like this. Okay, yeah. So a single asymmetrical heart tube oriented in a straight path is now getting bent in such a way. This is the cranial part. It's becoming more caudal part. So this has become caudal, and it has come to ventral part or the anterior path, cranial and anterior part. Whereas the caudal part, this end is now coming to lie at the cranial end, top end, cranial end, and as well as the posterior end or the dorsal end. So this is called as the bending process. Okay, so this bending process along with the lengthening process is happening somewhere by day 23 to 29, and this whole process is called as cardiac looping. So when they mention about the looping, they usually mention as D loop ventricles and L loop ventricles. So what is that meant by? Suppose you have a specimen of heart, say. This is the specimen of heart. So you have the right atrium, ventricle like this. So somewhere you have the aorta, you have the pulmonary arteries going like this. So when you have anteriorly, you're seeing the specimen from the anterior end. Actually place your hand, your right hand. Okay, so I'm taking my right hand and I'm drawing my right hand in such a way. This is my thumb. This is my thumb. This is my index finger. Okay. And somewhere have my middle finger. Okay. And I'm closing my ring on the little finger. So when I'm projecting my thumb, index finger like this, and this is somewhere this middle finger projected like this. So this part of thumb is the inflow part. This represents, the index finger represents the outflow part, and the middle finger represents the septal part or septum of ventricle. So if you have a specimen, you're anteriorly seeing the specimen and keeping your right hand to this, and if you find your inflow part, outflow part, septal part is exactly matching with that of your hand orientation, especially the right hand orientation, then we call the ventricle as D loop ventricles. Suppose the same, if you take your left hand and start drawing like this. So this is your thumb, then this is your index finger, this is somewhere your middle finger is facing, and you have closed your ring and the little finger. So if you have your left hand orientation of thumb, which is an inflow part, now inflow part, outflow is the index finger and this is the middle finger showing the septum. If anteriorly placed, when you're facing the heart specimen anterior and you're making your left hand orientation, if both this thing is matching, inflow part is matching with your left hand thumb, the outflow part of the ventricle matching with your index finger of your left hand orientation, if that is going to happen with that specimen of heart, then it is called as L-looped ventricle. So the normal looping is D-looping. D-looped ventricle is a normal looping of heart. Because of any anomaly which is leading to L-looped ventricles, there may be various orientation anomalies, outflow tract anomalies can happen. So we have finally completed our fourth subtopic, which is the cardiac looping.